It's 1347, and a merchant in London needs to pay for silk from Venice. No banks as we know them. No credit cards. No wire transfers. Just dangerous roads crawling with bandits, and a fortune in gold coins that could get you killed before you ever reached Italy. So, how did he do it? The answer lies in one of history's most ingenious inventions, a hidden financial network so sophisticated, so revolutionary, that it would shape the modern world. Knights turned bankers. Monks managing international currency exchanges. Italian families building empires on nothing but paper and trust. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, survival, and a system so ahead of its time that Wall Street would later steal its playbook. Tonight, we're diving deep into the shadows of medieval Europe, where fortunes were made with a quill and a handshake, and where the very foundations of modern capitalism were being quietly laid. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind our modern world, you're going to love this journey. Hit that like button to help this reach more history lovers, and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the past. Share this with anyone who thinks the Middle Ages were just knights and castles. They're in for a surprise. Now, let's begin. Let's go back to the year 1000. Europe is emerging from what historians dramatically called the Dark Ages, though it wasn't quite as dark as Hollywood makes it seem. Still, if you were a merchant trying to do business across borders, you faced a nightmare that would make modern logistics look like child's play. Imagine you're a wool trader in England. You've got high-quality fleece that Flemish weavers are desperate to buy. The profit margins are incredible, you could triple your investment. There's just one tiny problem: you need to physically transport your payment back home. We're talking hundreds of pounds of silver coins, maybe even gold if you're particularly successful. And between Flanders and England? About 200 miles of territory controlled by dozens of different lords, each one potentially hostile, definitely opportunistic, and absolutely willing to tax traveling merchants. This wasn't paranoia. Robbery was practically an industry. Bandits worked the major trade routes like modern highway robbers, except there was no police force to call, no insurance to claim, and definitely no sympathy if you showed up at your destination empty-handed. Your own hired guards might decide your cargo was worth more than their wages. River crossings had toll collectors. Forest paths had outlaws. Even the legitimate authorities would charge you fees at every border crossing, and medieval Europe had borders everywhere. So what did merchants do? Some traveled in armed caravans, strength in numbers. Others tried to hide their wealth, sewing coins into clothing, hollowing out wagon axles, getting creative with deception. The really cautious ones sent their money in multiple shipments with different carriers, hoping at least some would make it through. It was expensive, dangerous, and incredibly inefficient. But here's where it gets interesting. Money itself was a problem even before you tried to move it. Europe didn't have a unified currency. Not even close. England had its pounds and pennies. France had livres and deniers. Italian city-states each minted their own coins. German principalities, Spanish kingdoms, Low Countries, everyone was stamping out their own money. And we're not talking about minor variations. We're talking about hundreds of different currencies, each with different weights of precious metal, different levels of purity, different values that fluctuated based on who was debasing their coinage this year. Let's say you finally made it to Flanders with your wool. The buyer wants to pay you in Flemish groats. Great, except those groats are worthless back in England. You need to convert them to English pennies, which means finding a money changer, who's going to take a cut for the exchange. And you better hope that money changer is honest about the metal content, because coin clipping, literally shaving edges off coins to steal the precious metal, was rampant. Some coins had so many notches and shavings they looked like they'd been through a war. The physical reality of medieval money tells you everything about why this system was broken. Coins were made of precious metals, silver mostly, gold for larger transactions. This meant money was heavy. Really heavy. A decent-sized business transaction might require you to transport hundreds of pounds of coins. Try imagining yourself carrying 50 pounds of silver across hostile territory and you'll understand why merchants were desperate for a better way. And then there was the trust problem. How do you do business with someone you've never met, in a city you've never visited, speaking a language you don't understand? There were no corporate contracts enforced by international law. No courts you could appeal to across borders. No credit rating agencies. No background checks. Business happened through personal relationships, family connections, and reputation, which took years, sometimes generations, to establish. The Catholic Church, which dominated medieval life, made everything more complicated. Christian doctrine strictly forbade usury, charging interest on loans. The Bible was pretty clear about this, and the Church took it seriously. Which meant that lending money for profit was a sin. A serious sin. The kind that could get you excommunicated, which in medieval terms meant social death and, according to church teaching, actual damnation. This created a bizarre situation where everyone needed credit to do business, but no Christian could legally provide it. Some Jewish communities filled this gap, they weren't bound by Christian law and could charge interest. But this created its own problems, including resentment, persecution, and periodic expulsions that destabilized the entire financial ecosystem. So picture the medieval economy: dangerous transport, fragmented currencies, no legal framework for international trade, no legitimate credit system, and no institutions you could trust with your money. This was the world that needed to invent modern banking. And somehow, against all odds, it did. The first glimmers of change came from an unexpected source. Not merchants, not kings, not scholars. Warriors. Specifically, warrior monks who'd taken vows of poverty but ended up managing one of the largest fortunes in Europe. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. We know them as the Knights Templar. The year is 1119, Jerusalem. The Crusades are in full swing, and Christian pilgrims are flooding into the Holy Land, thrilled to visit the sites they'd only heard about in sermons. There's just one problem: many of them are getting robbed and killed on the way. The roads to Jerusalem are as dangerous as any medieval highway, maybe worse, because everyone knows pilgrims are carrying money for their journey. 9 French knights decide to do something about it. They form a military order dedicated to protecting these pilgrims, taking monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The King of Jerusalem gives them headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the site traditionally identified as Solomon's Temple. Hence the name, Knights Templar. Noble cause, right? Warrior monks protecting the faithful. Except something remarkable happens over the next century. These knights who swore to own nothing end up building a financial empire that would make modern banks jealous. Here's how it worked. Pilgrims still needed to fund their journey, but they didn't want to carry gold across thousands of miles of dangerous territory. The Templars offered an elegant solution: deposit your money at a Templar house in Europe, get a coded letter of credit, travel light to Jerusalem, then withdraw your funds at a Templar facility in the Holy Land. It was brilliant. Simple. And it required something that didn't really exist yet: a trusted institution with presence in multiple countries. The Templars had that trust. They were monks, bound by sacred vows. They were also warriors, which meant their facilities were fortresses that could actually protect the deposits. And they had houses spreading across Europe and the Middle East, creating the infrastructure for what was essentially the first international banking network. But they didn't stop at simple deposits. The Templars started offering loans. Kings needed money for wars, crusades were expensive. Nobles needed funds for ransoms when they got captured. Merchants needed capital for ventures. The Templars, sitting on massive deposits from pilgrims and increasingly wealthy from donations, had capital to lend. Now wait, didn't we just say the Church forbade usury? Yes. But the Templars got creative. They didn't charge interest, they charged administrative fees, and exchange costs, and various other expenses that effectively functioned as interest but technically weren't called that. It was financial engineering, medieval style. The church knew what was happening but looked the other way, probably because the Templars were funding crusades and the Pope himself occasionally needed loans. The Templars' financial activities grew sophisticated fast. They offered safe deposit services, you could store valuables in their fortified preceptories. They facilitated currency exchanges. They even started managing estates for nobles who were off fighting, essentially acting as trustees. By the 1200s, the Templars were handling royal treasuries. The King of France kept his money in the Templar house in Paris. English kings regularly borrowed from them. Think about what this meant. These warrior monks had created the foundations of modern banking, secure deposits, international transfers, loans, currency exchange, wealth management, even a form of checks through their letters of credit. And they did it 2 centuries before the Medici, 5 centuries before modern banks. Their success also revealed something crucial about finance: it's built on trust and infrastructure. The Templars had both. Their religious vows made people trust them with money. Their military might made people trust that the money would stay safe. And their international network made complex transactions possible. But there was a darker side to their story, one that would echo through financial history. When you control that much money, you become powerful. Dangerously powerful. By the early 1300s, the Templars were wealthy enough to rival kingdoms. They owned land across Europe. They had fortresses, fleets of ships, and thousands of members. And they answered to no one except the Pope. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, saw an opportunity. On Friday, October 13, 1307, yes, that's where we get the superstition about Friday the 13th, Philip ordered the mass arrest of Templars across France. The charges? Heresy, idol worship, corruption. Were the charges true? Almost certainly not. Were they effective? Absolutely. What followed was brutal. Templars were tortured until they confessed to whatever their captors wanted. Their leaders were burned at stake. Their order was dissolved by papal decree in 1312. And their assets? Technically transferred to another military order. Actually, most of it ended up in royal treasuries, especially Philip's. The fall of the Templars sent shockwaves through medieval finance. Here was proof that even the most trusted institution could be destroyed if it threatened royal power. But the systems they'd created didn't die with them. The infrastructure remained. The idea remained. And other groups, watching from the sidelines, learned valuable lessons about finance and power. The Italian merchants, in particular, had been paying attention. While the Templars were building their empire in the north, something extraordinary was happening in Italy. A collection of city-states, Florence, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, were transforming from regional trading posts into economic powerhouses that would dominate European finance for centuries. The Italians had advantages. Geography, for one, they sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, connecting Europe to Byzantine markets and beyond. But more importantly, they had necessity. Italian merchants weren't operating with royal backing or religious authority like the Templars. They were businessmen trying to survive in a viciously competitive environment. And that pressure bred innovation. Let's start in Florence, around 1200. The city is booming from wool trade. Florentine merchants are buying raw wool from England, processing it with superior Italian techniques, then selling finished cloth across Europe at enormous profit. But they're running into the same problems everyone faces: how to move money safely, how to track complex transactions, how to manage partnerships across long distances. A Florentine merchant family, we'll call them the Alberti, though several families were innovating simultaneously, starts keeping ledgers in a new way. Instead of just recording transactions chronologically, they create separate accounts for each business relationship. Every transaction gets recorded twice, once as a credit in one account, once as a debit in another. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. Always balanced. This doesn't sound revolutionary to modern ears because we live with double-entry bookkeeping every day. But in medieval Europe, this was like inventing the internet. Suddenly, merchants could track complex networks of transactions with clarity. They could see at a glance who owed them money, who they owed, what their profits actually were. They could audit themselves. They could catch errors and, crucially, detect fraud. Venice took this further. Venetian merchants were operating even more complex trade networks. Their ships sailed to Alexandria, Constantinople, the Black Sea, bringing back spices, silk and goods from as far as China. Managing this required sophisticated financial instruments. The Venetians perfected something called the commenda, a form of limited partnership perfect for risky ventures. Here's how it worked: an investor would put up capital for a trading voyage. The merchant sailor would contribute his labor and expertise. Profits would be split, typically 75% to the investor, 25% to the merchant. But here's the clever part: if the ship sank or got captured by pirates, the investor ate the loss. The merchant only risked his time and effort. This was venture capital, medieval style. It allowed wealthy Venetians to invest in multiple voyages, spreading risk. It let ambitious merchants get funding without collateral. And it transformed Venice into a maritime empire built as much on financial innovation as on naval power. Genoa competed by pioneering compere, essentially government bonds. When Genoa needed money for wars, instead of just borrowing from individual bankers, they'd sell shares of future tax revenue to investors. These shares could be bought and sold, creating an early form of securities market. You could buy a piece of Genoa's customs revenue and collect dividends, or sell your share if you needed cash. It was a way of turning government debt into tradable assets. But perhaps the most important Italian innovation was the bill of exchange, which deserves its own chapter. For now, understand that Florentine and Venetian merchants transformed it from a simple IOU into a sophisticated financial instrument that could move money across Europe without physically moving coins. The Italian banking families, Bardi, Peruzzi, Acciaiuoli in Florence, Grimaldi and Spinola in Genoa, the great merchant houses of Venice, began opening branches across Europe. By the 1300s, Italian bankers had offices in London, Paris, Bruges, Barcelona. They were lending to kings, financing wars, managing papal finances, and moving money across continents. These weren't Templar-style religious institutions. These were family businesses, dynasties built on financial acumen rather than military might. The Bardi and Peruzzi became so wealthy and powerful that they loaned massive sums to Edward III of England to finance his wars against France. We're talking about sums equivalent to England's annual revenue. This led to disaster. Edward defaulted in 1345, triggering the collapse of both banks and sending shockwaves through European finance. But even that catastrophe demonstrated how interconnected the medieval economy had become. A default in England could destroy banks in Florence, affect wool markets in Flanders, and impact trade across the Mediterranean. The Italians had essentially created the architecture of modern capitalism: corporate structures, credit markets, securities trading, international banking networks, even the beginnings of insurance through mutual aid societies. And they did it not through theoretical innovation but through practical necessity, merchants solving real problems with clever solutions. One family would take these innovations further than anyone. They would transform Florence into the banking capital of Europe, manipulate papal elections, and create a dynasty that would produce popes, queens, and some of the greatest art in human history. The Medici were coming. Let's solve a puzzle that stumped medieval Europe for centuries. How do you send money across a continent without actually sending money? Remember our wool merchant from the beginning? He's in Bruges, just sold his wool, and needs to pay his supplier in Florence. He's got a pouch full of Flemish groats. His supplier wants Florentine florins. And he absolutely, under no circumstances, wants to carry that money across the Alps where bandits, tolls, and weather could destroy him. Enter the bill of exchange, possibly the most important financial instrument you've never heard of. Here's the magic trick. Our merchant in Bruges goes to a local banker, let's say a representative of the Medici. He gives them his Flemish groats. In return, he gets a piece of paper. This paper is a letter, addressed to the Medici branch in Florence, instructed to pay the bearer, or more specifically, our merchant supplier, a certain amount in Florentine florins. The merchant sends this letter to Florence. It weighs nothing. Costs almost nothing to transport. Can't be robbed for its intrinsic value, it's just paper. But when it arrives in Florence and is presented to the Medici bank there, it becomes money. Real, spendable florins. The wool supplier gets paid. The merchant never touched a coin. You might think this is just a check, right? Not quite. It's cleverer than that. First, the bill of exchange handled currency conversion automatically. The Bruges banker and the Florence banker had agreed upon exchange rates, factored into the transaction. This meant merchants didn't need to understand complex currency markets, the bankers handled it. Second, the bill of exchange had a time delay built in. These letters typically came due 30, 60, or 90 days after issue. This gave the merchant time to complete other transactions, and it gave the banking family time to move funds through their network. But here's where it gets really clever, that time delay essentially functioned as credit. The merchant got immediate value, the letter, but the bank didn't have to pay out for months. Third, and this is the part that let them circumvent usury laws, the exchange rate incorporated profit for the bank. They'd exchange your Flemish groats at one rate in Bruges, then exchange them again to Florentine florins at a rate that included their fee. It wasn't technically interest, it was an exchange fee across currencies and distance. The church grumbled but generally allowed it. The sophistication of this system is staggering. Bills of exchange could be endorsed, signed over to third parties. They could be chained, one bill used as collateral for another. They could be traded, sold at a discount if you needed cash before the due date. Essentially, they created a paper currency backed not by gold or royal decree but by the reputation of banking families. Let's watch a complex transaction unfold. It's 1450. A Florentine textile merchant wants to buy English wool, but he also owes money to a spice trader in Venice, who in turn needs to pay a silk merchant in Bruges. Our Florentine merchant goes to the Medici bank in Florence. He arranges a bill of exchange payable in London, this covers his wool purchase. But he also arranges for the Medici's London branch to issue a bill payable in Venice, covering his debt to the spice trader. That Venetian bill then gets endorsed and sent to Bruges for the silk merchant. 3 transactions, 3 cities, 3 currencies, 0 coins physically transported. Just paper and trust moving through banking networks. The Medici coordinate everything through internal ledgers, balancing debts between their branches. They make money on every exchange, every transfer, every delay. And everyone else saves money on security, transport, and time. This system enabled the great trade fairs of medieval Europe, Champagne, Lyons, Frankfurt, Bruges. These fairs became financial clearing houses where merchants would arrive with stacks of bills of exchange. They'd spend days reconciling debts. I owe you 500 florins on this bill, you owe me 300 on that one, net it out to 200, here's a new bill for the balance. Actual coins changed hands only for net balances, reducing the need for physical currency by something like 90%. The bill of exchange also enabled long-distance partnership. A Florentine merchant could have a factor, an agent, operating in London. The factor would buy wool using bills of exchange drawn on the Florence house. The factor and merchant might never physically meet, yet they're conducting complex business through paper instruments and trust. But like all financial innovations, the bill of exchange created new risks. What if the issuing bank collapsed before the bill came due? What if the letter was forged? What if exchange rates shifted dramatically between issue and payment? Merchants developed elaborate verification systems, code words, specific phrasing, watermarks, signatures witnessed by notaries. Banking families jealously guarded their reputations because their entire business model depended on trust. A single default could destroy generations of credibility. This created an interesting dynamic. Bankers were often more reliable than kings, because kings could default by decree while bankers lived or died by their reputation. The bill of exchange network also became an intelligence network. Banking families with branches across Europe were receiving letters constantly, detailing local conditions, market prices, political developments. They knew about wars before armies marched, about harvests before markets adjusted, about defaults before public announcements. Information was profit, and the banking networks were the medieval equivalent of Reuters or Bloomberg terminals. This paper revolution transformed medieval commerce. It allowed trade to scale beyond what physical currency could support. It created credit markets. It enabled the coordination of complex international ventures. And it set the stage for even more sophisticated financial instruments, promissory notes, letters of credit, early forms of insurance. But we still haven't addressed the elephant in the medieval room. If charging interest was a sin, how did any of this credit economy actually function? The Bible is pretty clear about usury. Deuteronomy 23 verse 19, "You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother." Exodus 22 verse 25, "If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him." The medieval church took these commandments seriously. Charging interest wasn't just illegal, it was a mortal sin that could damn your soul. The logic was theological and philosophical. Money, according to Aristotle and church scholars, was barren. It couldn't reproduce itself like livestock or generate value like land. So charging someone for the use of money was unnatural, even sinful. Time belonged to God alone. Selling time through interest was trying to sell something you didn't own. This created an enormous problem. How do you run an economy without credit? How do you fund businesses, invest in ventures, or smooth cash flow without the ability to borrow and lend at interest? Medieval Europe found ways. Very creative ways. First, there was the obvious loophole we've already seen, currency exchange. If you borrowed £100 in London and repaid 110 florins in Florence 3 months later, was that interest or just exchange rate fluctuation? The church couldn't definitively say, and bankers took full advantage. Bills of exchange became elaborate structures to hide interest in currency conversion and distance. Then there were partnership arrangements. Instead of lending you money at interest, I become your partner. I give you capital, you run the business, we split profits. This was considered acceptable because we're sharing risk. If the venture fails, I lose my investment. The commenda contracts we discussed earlier were essentially interest-bearing loans disguised as partnerships. Penalties for late payment were another dodge. The contract would specify no interest, but if you failed to repay on time, and the timeline would be deliberately tight, you'd owe substantial penalties. These penalties could be structured to make late payment almost inevitable, turning the penalty into de facto interest. The church also distinguished between usury and compensation for risk or opportunity cost. If lending you money prevented me from making a profitable investment elsewhere, I could charge you for that lost opportunity. This was called lucrum cessans, cessation of profit. Similarly, if late repayment caused me actual financial harm, I could demand compensation, called damnum emergens, emerging damage. Clever merchants structured loans to always involve one or both, building interest into the contract through these compensations. Some simply ignored the prohibition and dealt with the consequences. Pawnbrokers, often Jewish, since they weren't bound by Christian law, would openly lend at interest. They'd take items as collateral and charge storage fees that functioned as interest. If you didn't repay, they kept the item. It was straightforward, practical, and technically heretical for Christians. The church's position softened over time, especially as church itself needed credit. The papacy was running what amounted to a multinational corporation, managing properties across Europe, funding crusades, maintaining diplomatic operations. Papal bankers, invariably Italian, became essential to church operations. These bankers were definitely charging interest, just calling it something else, and the church looked the other way because the alternative was financial paralysis. By the 1400s, some church scholars were developing new theological justifications. They argued that commerce itself was risky and deserved compensation. They distinguished between lending to the poor, which remained usurious and sinful, and lending for business ventures, which was merely prudent investment. The Franciscan friars, surprisingly, were at the forefront of this rethinking, establishing Monte di Pieta, Mounts of Piety, which were essentially charitable pawnshops offering low-interest loans to the poor. There's something darkly fascinating about watching medieval theologians twist themselves into intellectual pretzels to justify what everyone knew the economy needed. They'd cite obscure biblical interpretations, invoke Aristotle, and construct elaborate logical frameworks, all to reach the conclusion that yes, actually, charging interest was fine under certain specific circumstances that happened to cover most commercial lending. The Medici were masters of this game. They structured their loans as anything but loans. Currency exchanges, partnership contracts, penalty clauses, opportunity compensation, whatever worked. They even funded the papacy itself, becoming official papal bankers in the 1400s. The irony was delicious. The institution that forbade usury was borrowing at interest from bankers who'd mastered the art of disguising interest. This tension between religious prohibition and economic necessity shaped medieval finance in profound ways. It encouraged financial innovation. If you can't do something directly, you find indirect methods. It created advantages for Jewish bankers who could operate openly in the credit market. And it demonstrated something fundamental about economics: if people need something badly enough, they'll find ways around any prohibition, legal or theological. The usury debate also revealed class tensions. Lending to fund commerce was increasingly acceptable. Lending to desperate peasants at predatory rates was still considered sinful. The Church was essentially making a distinction between productive and consumptive lending, between capital investment and exploitative debt. It was imperfect, often hypocritical, but it showed an awareness that not all lending was created equal. By 1500, the battle was effectively over. Interest-bearing loans were common, barely disguised, and broadly tolerated. The Protestant Reformation would further liberalize attitudes toward finance. Calvin explicitly allowed moderate interest, accelerating the development of credit markets in Protestant regions. But even before that, Catholic Europe had found ways to make capitalism work within religious constraints. The lesson? Ideology is powerful, but economics is persistent. Medieval Europe needed credit to function, and so credit found a way to exist, whatever theologians said. The same banks and families that worked around usury prohibitions would go on to fund the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the commercial revolution that transformed Europe from a feudal backwater into a global economic powerhouse. And no family did this more successfully than the Medici. Let's talk about what happens when a banking family gets really, really good at playing the game. The Medici didn't invent banking. They didn't even invent most of the financial instruments they used. What they did was perfect the art of turning money into power and power into more money, creating a feedback loop that would dominate Florence for generations and influence European politics for centuries. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici established the family bank in 1397. He was smart, cautious, and had one key insight: diversification. Instead of concentrating on one type of business, the Medici Bank would do everything: currency exchange, merchant banking, wool trade, silk trade, even mining alum, a mineral used in textile production. But Giovanni's real genius was institutional. He structured the Medici Bank as a network of partnerships rather than a single entity. Each branch, Florence, Rome, Venice, Bruges, London, Geneva, was a separate legal partnership. The Medici family held majority stakes, but local managers had skin in the game through their partnership shares. This meant branches were run by people with personal incentive to succeed, while the Medici family controlled the network and collected profits from every node. It was brilliant risk management. If the London branch failed, it didn't automatically destroy the Venice branch. If a manager went rogue, the damage was contained. And because profits were shared with managers, the Medici attracted the best talent in European banking. Giovanni also cultivated the papacy. He became banker to the papal court, managing church finances and facilitating the transfer of funds from across Christendom to Rome. This was fantastically profitable. The church collected tithes, donations, and fees from every corner of Europe, all needing to be converted and transferred. The Medici took a cut of everything. When Giovanni died in 1429, his son Cosimo inherited a thriving bank and a crucial lesson: money was power, but you had to use it carefully. Cosimo would take this to an entirely new level. Cosimo de' Medici understood that in Republican Florence, being too openly powerful was dangerous. The city had a tradition of exiling anyone who seemed to threaten the Republic. So Cosimo never held official titles. He never proclaimed himself ruler. Instead, he wielded power through patronage, debt, and strategic relationships. Here's how it worked: Cosimo would lend money to Florentine politicians, merchants, and nobles, often at favorable rates, sometimes interest-free. These weren't commercial transactions, they were investments in influence. When political decisions needed to be made, when votes needed to be cast, when favors needed to be granted, Cosimo's debtors knew who to support. He effectively bought loyalty without the crude appearance of bribery. The Medici Bank grew even wealthier under Cosimo. At its peak, it had branches in major European cities, managed church finances across the continent, and funded everyone from the Pope to the King of France. The family was probably the wealthiest in Europe. Estimates suggest they had more liquid capital than most kingdoms. But Cosimo's real legacy was cultural. He spent an enormous amount of Medici money on art, architecture, libraries, and scholars. The Medici became patrons of Fra Angelico, Donatello, Brunelleschi. They funded the completion of Florence's cathedral dome, one of the architectural wonders of the age. They collected classical manuscripts and sponsored humanist scholars. This wasn't altruism, it was branding. By positioning themselves as patrons of culture and learning, the Medici transformed their image from mere bankers to cultural leaders, Renaissance princes in all but name. When Cosimo died in 1464, Florence officially titled him Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. Not bad for a banker who never held public office. His grandson Lorenzo took this to even greater heights. Lorenzo the Magnificent, as he became known, was more politician and cultural icon than banker. He wrote poetry, hosted philosophical discussions, patronized Michelangelo and Botticelli. Under Lorenzo, Florence became the cultural capital of Europe. But here's the thing about turning banking into power: it's expensive. All that patronage, all those interest-free loans, all that cultural spending drained Medici capital. The bank began to struggle. Branches failed. Loans went bad. When Lorenzo died in 1492, the Medici Bank was in serious decline. Yet the Medici dynasty endured, because they'd successfully converted financial power into political and cultural legitimacy. They'd become more than bankers, they were Florentine identity itself. Even after they were temporarily expelled, they returned. Even after the bank collapsed, they persisted. Medici became popes, queens of France, grand dukes of Tuscany. The Medici method revealed something crucial about medieval finance: banking was never just about money. It was about relationships, reputation, and power. The most successful banking families understood they were operating in political and social spheres as much as economic ones. Money was a tool, not an end goal. This philosophy shaped how medieval finance actually worked on the ground, not in ledgers and contracts, but in the great trading fairs where merchants, bankers, and nobles gathered to do business face to face. Picture a city that appears 4 times a year, exists for 6 weeks, then vanishes. Tens of thousands of merchants converging from across Europe. Hundreds of tons of goods changing hands. Millions in currency being exchanged. And almost all of it happening on credit, reconciled through paper instruments and mutual trust. Welcome to the medieval trade fair. The Champagne fairs, held in the French towns of Troyes, Provins, Lagny, and Bar-sur-Aube, were the beating heart of medieval commerce from roughly 1150 to 1350. These weren't village markets selling local produce. These were international financial centers that made London Stock Exchange look simple by comparison. Here's how it worked. Each fair followed a predictable cycle. First came the entry period, when merchants arrived and set up. Then the cloth fair, where textile merchants, the backbone of medieval trade, would display and sell their goods. Then the leather fair. Then the weight-based goods fair for spices, dyes, and other valuable commodities. Finally, the most important phase, the payment period. During the payment period, actual finance happened. Merchants would gather with their agents, bankers, and notaries to reconcile accounts. Remember all those bills of exchange we discussed? This is where they came due. Merchants would present letters of credit, bills payable, promissory notes. They'd net out debts. You owe me £500 for wool, I owe you £300 for wine, let's call it £200 net, and issue a new bill for the balance. The champagne fairs essentially functioned as a massive clearing house. Through netting, merchants could reduce the need for physical currency by enormous amounts. One scholar estimated that at peak times, only 10 to 15% of transactions actually required coin changing hands, the rest was handled through credit instruments. But fairs were more than financial centers. They were information exchanges. A merchant from Venice would hear about harvest conditions in England. A Florentine banker would learn about political instability in France. A Flemish cloth trader would discover new markets in Spain. Information was currency, and the fairs were where that currency flowed most freely. The logistics of these fairs were staggering. The Counts of Champagne provided protection. Fair attendees had safe conduct, meaning they couldn't be arrested for debts or crimes committed outside the fair. This was crucial because merchants might owe money to enemies, rival cities, even people they'd wronged. The fair was neutral ground where business could happen regardless of outside conflicts. Special fair courts handled disputes quickly. If you accused someone of fraud, judges would hear the case within days, not months or years as in regular courts. This speed was essential. Merchants couldn't wait around for lengthy legal proceedings. Justice had to be swift because business moved fast. The fairs also had their own security force and strict rules. Weights and measures were standardized and enforced. Counterfeit coins were punished severely. Fraud could get you banned from all champagne fairs, which was essentially commercial death. Your reputation was everything, and the fairs protected that reputational economy fiercely. Multiple currencies circulated, which created opportunities for money changers. These specialists would set up tables, hence bank from the Italian banco for table, and exchange coins all day. They needed encyclopedic knowledge of hundreds of currencies, their metal content, their relative values. A good money changer could assess a coin's authenticity by weight, sound, and appearance. They were walking databases of financial information. Banking families like the Medici, Bardi, and Peruzzi maintained permanent representatives at the major fairs. These agents would facilitate transactions, issue credit, and gather intelligence. They were the nodes in the network, connecting Italian capital to Northern European commerce. The Champagne fairs declined after 1300 for several reasons. Warfare made the routes less safe. Italian merchants developed sea routes that bypassed France entirely. And perhaps most importantly, banking networks became sophisticated enough that merchants didn't need to physically gather to reconcile accounts, they could do it through correspondence and their banking relationships. But the fair model persisted. Bruges in Flanders became a major commercial center. The Frankfurt fairs in Germany. Medina del Campo in Spain. Geneva. Lyons. Each developed its own character, its own specialties, but all followed the fundamental pattern: bring merchants together, facilitate trade, reconcile debts, exchange information. These fairs demonstrated something profound about medieval finance. Despite all the sophisticated instruments and banking networks, despite all the paper and ledgers, business still fundamentally relied on personal relationships and physical presence. You couldn't just wire money and trust the system, you needed to look someone in the eye, shake hands, share meals, build trust over years of repeated interactions. This human element was both the strength and weakness of medieval finance. It created deep, reliable business relationships that could span generations. But it also meant the system was vulnerable to personal failures, betrayals, and the simple reality that people die. Which brings us to one of the most dramatic aspects of medieval finance: what happened when the people who owed the most money, kings, decided they simply wouldn't pay. Let's talk about the most dangerous clients any medieval banker could have: monarchs. Kings needed enormous amounts of money. Wars were expensive, you had to pay soldiers, buy equipment, feed armies, and maintain sieges that could last months. Crusades cost fortunes. Building castles, maintaining courts, funding diplomatic missions, it all required capital that royal revenues couldn't always cover. So kings borrowed. They borrowed from Italian banking houses, from the Templars, from wealthy nobles, from anyone with liquid capital. And here's the problem: what happens when the most powerful person in the kingdom decides not to repay his debts? The Bardi and Peruzzi families found out the hard way. In the 1330s and 1340s, they lent enormous sums to Edward III of England. We're talking about 1.5 million florins, roughly equivalent to England's entire annual revenue. Edward needed the money to finance his claim to the French throne, launching what would become the 100 Years' War. The loans were secured against English customs revenue, particularly wool exports. This seemed safe: England was Europe's wool powerhouse, and wool taxes were reliable. The Bardi and Peruzzi essentially controlled English wool trade in exchange for their loans, taking their repayment directly from export revenues. Except Edward's war went badly at first. Expenses spiraled. And in 1345, Edward simply stopped paying. He declared he couldn't afford the debt service. What were the Italian banks going to do? Sue the King of England? Seize English assets? Send an army? They couldn't. Royal default was the ultimate creditor nightmare: you had no recourse. The Bardi declared bankruptcy in 1346. The Peruzzi followed in 1343. These weren't minor banks, they were among the largest financial institutions in Europe, with branches across the continent. Their collapse sent shockwaves through the Italian banking system and contributed to a broader financial crisis. Thousands lost money. Other banks that had borrowed from or lent to the Bardi and Peruzzi failed. Merchants who had deposits or credit lines suddenly found themselves cut off. The interconnected nature of medieval finance meant that one major default could cascade through the entire system. But here's what's fascinating: Edward's default didn't destroy English credit forever. Within years, other Italian banks were lending to English kings again. Why? Because despite the risk, lending to monarchs was incredibly profitable when they did pay. The returns were worth the gamble, especially if you could get good collateral or payment guarantees. This created a strange dynamic. Banking families knew that royal loans were risky but couldn't resist the profits. Kings knew they could default with limited consequences but also knew they'd need to borrow again in the future. It was a delicate dance of mutual dependency and mutual threat. French kings had their own approach to financial problems. When Philip IV found himself deeply indebted to the Templars, he didn't just default, he destroyed the entire organization and seized their assets. When Philip VI needed money, he debased the coinage, mixing cheaper metals into gold and silver coins. This was essentially a hidden tax: everyone's money was suddenly worth less, but the king could mint more coins from the same amount of precious metal. Debasement was a constant temptation for medieval rulers. It provided quick revenue without the political cost of raising taxes. But it destroyed trust in currency, created inflation, and punished savers and creditors. Merchants learned to specify loans in specific weights of precious metal rather than nominal currency amounts, trying to protect themselves from royal monetary manipulation. Some monarchs were more reliable. The Medici successfully lent to various popes, who generally repaid because papal authority rested partly on maintaining moral and financial credibility. The Medici also lent to the French monarchy, carefully managing their exposure and diversifying their royal clients to avoid catastrophic concentration of risk. The bankruptcy of kingdoms also revealed the limits of medieval banking power. For all their wealth and influence, banking families were ultimately vulnerable to political power. A king could ruin them with a decree. A city could expel them through legislation. Their money bought influence, but not immunity. This is why smart banking families like the Medici pursued political power alongside financial success. Better to be inside the power structure, or even running it, than to remain merely wealthy outsiders vulnerable to royal whims. The royal default problem persisted for centuries. Spain defaulted multiple times in the 1500s and 1600s, each time devastating banking families who thought they had secured their loans. France defaulted repeatedly. Even into the modern era, sovereign debt remained one of the riskiest propositions in finance. Medieval bankers learned hard lessons: diversify your clients, never put all your capital into royal loans, secure collateral when possible, and maintain political relationships that might protect you when things go wrong. These lessons, written in the bankruptcy ledgers of great banking houses, would shape financial practice for generations. The collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi, the destruction of the Templars, the constant threat of royal default, these weren't just historical footnotes. They were reminders that even the most sophisticated financial system was built on a foundation of trust, reputation, and ultimately, the willingness of the powerful to honor their obligations. And yet, despite these catastrophic failures, medieval finance persisted and evolved. The tools and techniques developed during these centuries would survive to shape the modern world in ways few medieval merchants could have imagined. So here we are, centuries later. You're watching this on a device that cost money you probably didn't hand over in coins. Maybe you used a credit card, a plastic descendant of the bill of exchange. Maybe you financed it, borrowing at interest rates that medieval theologians would have condemned as usury. You're participating in systems that trace directly back to those Italian merchants and warrior monks. Let's connect the dots. Double-entry bookkeeping, pioneered by Italian merchants in the 1200s, is still the foundation of modern accounting. Every business, from corner stores to multinational corporations, tracks their finances using the same basic principle: debits and credits must balance. When Luca Pacioli published his treatise on bookkeeping in 1494, he wasn't inventing something new, he was documenting practices Italian merchants had been using for 2 centuries. The bill of exchange evolved into the check, the bank draft, the wire transfer. The fundamental concept, moving value through paper instruments rather than physical currency, underpins our entire financial system. When you transfer money electronically, you're using a principle medieval merchants would recognize immediately. Letters of credit still exist, virtually unchanged from their medieval form. International trade still uses them. A Chinese manufacturer shipping goods to an American retailer will often require a letter of credit from a reputable bank, guaranteeing payment. It's the same trust mechanism, the same risk mitigation, the same basic structure that Florentine merchants used 6 centuries ago. The concept of limited liability partnerships, tested in Venetian commenda contracts, became the foundation of modern corporate structure. The idea that you could invest in a venture without risking your entire fortune revolutionized commerce. Joint stock companies, limited liability corporations, venture capital, all descendants of medieval partnerships. Government bonds, first developed by Italian city-states, are now fundamental to modern finance. Countries fund themselves through debt instruments traded on global markets. The mechanism is more sophisticated, the scale is vastly larger, but the basic concept, turning government debt into tradable securities, comes straight from medieval Genoa. Even the physical infrastructure persists. The Rothschild banking family, which dominated 19th-century finance, operated through a network of family branches across Europe, exactly the Medici model. Modern investment banks maintain offices in financial centers worldwide, coordinating through internal systems, again, the same basic structure. The medieval solution to the usury problem, disguising interest through various fees and mechanisms, still happens today. When you take out a mortgage, you pay points and origination fees and various charges that effectively increase your interest rate. When you use a credit card abroad, currency conversion fees echo the exchange profits medieval bankers extracted. The packaging has changed, but the principle endures. Banking families learned that reputation was everything, that trust was the true currency. Modern finance still runs on this principle. Credit ratings, brand reputation, institutional trust, these intangible assets can be worth more than physical capital. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, it wasn't because they lacked assets, it was because they lost trust, and in finance, trust is everything. The medieval struggle with royal defaults anticipated modern sovereign debt crises. When Argentina defaulted in 2001, when Greece required bailouts in 2010, creditors faced the same fundamental problem medieval bankers did: you can't force a country to pay. Modern mechanisms like the IMF and World Bank exist partly to manage this problem that medieval bankers solved through relationship management and diversification. Even the dark sides of medieval finance have modern parallels. The financial crisis of 2008 resembled medieval banking collapses: interconnected institutions, complex instruments that few understood, cascading failures when one major player went down. The Bardi and Peruzzi collapse would seem familiar to anyone who watched Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns fail. The medieval fairs evolved into stock exchanges. The New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange, Tokyo, Hong Kong, these are where global commerce coordinates, where prices are set, where information flows. The mechanism is electronic rather than face-to-face, but the function is identical, bringing together buyers and sellers, facilitating exchange, reconciling accounts. Perhaps most importantly, medieval finance established the principle that economic systems could be international. Trade could cross borders. Currency could be exchanged. Credit could flow between countries. This seems obvious now, but it wasn't always. Medieval merchants built the first truly international economic system, and were still living in the world they created. The creativity medieval bankers showed in working around restrictions mirrors modern financial innovation. Whenever regulators create new rules, financial institutions find new structures. Medieval bankers dodging usury laws would recognize the spirit, if not the specific techniques, of modern tax avoidance, regulatory arbitrage, and creative financial engineering. There's something almost poetic about the fact that medieval Europe, supposedly backward and superstitious, invented so much of our modern financial world. While philosophers debated theology and knights fought wars, merchants and bankers were quietly building the systems that would matter more in the long run than any battlefield victory. They were pragmatic problem solvers facing real challenges: how to move money safely, how to trade across borders, how to fund ventures, how to manage risk. The solutions they developed weren't theoretical, they were practical innovations that worked, survived, and evolved into the structures we use today. When you use a credit card, check your bank balance online, or invest in the stock market, you're using tools that trace back to merchants in Florence, bankers in Bruges, and yes, even warrior monks protecting pilgrims. The medieval financial system wasn't a primitive precursor to modern finance, it was the foundation, the blueprint, the original innovation that made everything else possible. And perhaps that's the real story here. History isn't just kings and battles and dramatic events. It's also merchants solving problems, bankers building trust, and incremental innovations that accumulate into revolutionary change. Medieval finance was revolutionary, even if the revolution happened quietly, ledger by ledger, transaction by transaction, across centuries of patient development. The hidden financial system that ruled medieval Europe didn't just rule the medieval world, it built ours. And the next time you tap your card or check your investment portfolio, remember, you're living in a world those medieval merchants made possible. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content exploring the hidden stories that shaped our modern world. What other historical topics would you like to see covered? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.